Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much all for joining us tonight, and for everyone who is following this live on Facebook. Thank you very much for joining us wherever you are in the world. Sotheby's is hugely proud to be taking part in the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which is a nationwide year-long festival celebrating the impact which émigrés from Nazi-dominated Europe have made on British culture. If it wasn't for the considerable generosity of the lenders, we wouldn't have been able to put together this really first-class exhibition, which, to everyone who is streaming online, I really do encourage you to come down to see at Sotheby's London until the 9th of August. It's shining a light on an underappreciated, underdiscussed, but really significant part of modern art history. And on that note, we have an incredibly august panel who are going to be discussing the impact which dealers have made on the British art market. So with no further ado, I'll pass you over.
Very good. Good. Perhaps I should begin by introducing myself. My name is Monica Bohm-Duchen. I'm the initiator and creative director of the Insiders Outsiders Festival, which spans all the arts, runs through the year across the country. And I won't say any more except please do take a look at the website, www.insidersoutsiders.org, for a sense of the full range of what is on offer. But this exhibition is an integral and very important part of the bigger project. It's called, as you know, Brave New Visions: the émigrés who transformed the British art world, as though it is a given. And I think what this panel should be about tonight is a chance to look in a more nuanced and critical and analytical way at precisely the nature of that contribution. So that is the plan. I'm sure that will work out beautifully. It is just about the dealers. The publishers are going to have an event to themselves at 12 o'clock tomorrow morning. It's open to all. Need to register. I don't think it's quite booked up yet, but if you're interested, please be aware of that. And there's a whole related events program that also is well worthy of scrutiny. So I think without further ado, I will turn to René Gimpel here, fourth generation art dealer whose extraordinary and intensely moving family history is outlined in the exhibition adjacent to this room. It's given or recounted in much more detail in the online catalogue, which I would urge you also to look at when you have a chance. René, what I think we'll do to sort of start the ball rolling, as it were, is to start with you to say a few words, your own thoughts about the nature of what exactly it was that these refugee art dealers brought with them from their countries of origin, and how it impacted upon their activities as dealers in this country.
Thank you, Monica. Well, first of all, one of the things that I have learned in studying the remarkable book full of essays by many scholars that Monica has published, connected to Insiders Outsiders exhibition, plus my own thoughts on the subject because of my parents' involvement during the war, is an understanding, which I think we all have to bear in mind right from the beginning. By the outbreak of the war, 70,000 Jewish refugees had arrived and settled in the UK. When I say settled, they hadn't actually been absorbed into the society, because quite a few of them, including art dealers, for instance, Harry Fisher and Frank Lloyd of the Marlborough, and Bilbo, an art dealer and artist whom I didn't know before I read your book. They were interned. They were interned initially. When I say 70,000 arrived here, there were also the 10,000 children without their parents from the Kindertransport. But Jewish societies in this country had the names of 500,000 further people seeking refuge who were unable to get here and unable to escape the Nazi onslaught when Europe was occupied. So we start from, anyway, a situation where the refugees who then set up galleries here and had to abandon everything back in Austria and in Germany and in some other countries like Andras Kalman in Hungary, the situation for them is that they came with nothing. As soon as the war began seriously, they were enemy aliens, and a great many of them were interned, some for periods of a year or two, some longer. Luckily, most of the people involved in the art world were quickly fairly quickly released. And while they were in camps, and again it's something I've learned from studying the history, while they were in camps they organized art exhibitions. When they were released, if they were of serviceable age, and by the way, the Kindertransport children aged 17 and above, by the outbreak of there, were also interned as enemy aliens. So it's a somber period. When they were released, quite a few of them, and I'd say the two Marlborough directors were, and Bilbo, went into the Pioneer Corps, which was a corps made up mostly of emigrants to the UK, and from the Pioneer Corps they went in, a lot of them, in to serve on the frontline forces in the RAF, in the Navy, in the Army. And again, bear in mind that these were Austrian and German refugees. If they were of military age, they were incorporated into the armed services because it was a life and death situation. 1 in 7 refugee male Jews in this country who arrived served in the armed forces. That's a high number, and if they were captured, they risked being executed as traitors. So we have to go back to the war period and set the scene. Now these art dealers, and some who became art dealers later, had arrived with a very rich cultural heritage in Austria and in Germany, and in my own case, because it was slightly different, from France, and that was after the war. And the reason in this case was that my grandfather and my English grandmother, Florence Javine, the youngest sister of Joe Javine, Millbank, they decided in 1940 to stay in France and join the resistance. And 2 of their sons did, and another son came to England and joined the 8th Army and saw service at Monte Cassino and El Alamein. So in a sense, they were refugees in their own country, because in France they were hunted, that is, my grandfather and grandmother. Their goods were seized in Paris. The gallery was seized, the apartment was seized, everything was stripped. And throughout the war, my grandfather was on the move with various resistance movements, including, again, to bring it back to the art world, and I'll move in a minute to the question you put, but one of the resistance movements that he and Florence set up in 1940 was called Gloria. And it was funded by MI6, which was still active in Marseille until the Vichy government closed it down. And Gloria was set up by Gabrielle Buffon-Picabia, Francis Picabia's first wife. And 2 of the early adherents were Graham Greene and Somerset Maugham, who were down living on the coast. And one of the enduring active members of this resistance movement that lasted for 2 years until it was penetrated by a traitor and dismantled was Samuel Beckett, who was a national of a neutral country, but he still continued. So all power to people in the arts generally to having shown the courage and the understanding that you had to fight Nazism. When we come to the UK, we have a situation where even before the end of the war, a lot of these refugees who have had an important art historical background, have had training in restoration, have had training as artists, have formed a loose nexus mostly in London, backed by certain key figures. Again, thank you for your book, Roland Penrose, whom we know about, and Herbert Reed, but who were involved with these refugees, as Lord Clark, quite interestingly, through the National Gallery. And so there was a framework in which they could begin to advance if they so choose, and if they had found a backer or had the means, because they were mostly penniless when they arrived here, they could begin to form the nexus of an early art gallery movement. Why should it be that Jewish refugees from these countries should be doing this? In a way, this is a sociological question, and I'm not a sociologist. But one of the things about so many of these people, while they were in Germany and Austria, when they could still advance the careers of the avant-garde and become involved with the avant-garde before 1933 and the beginning of the closing down of the avant-garde, the closing down of the Bauhaus, Entarte Kunst exhibition and the other situations. One of the things is that the heritage that is carried on amongst a minority outsider group across Europe that has a total and passionate belief in education, in knowledge, in learning. It doesn't have to be in the arts, it can be in the sciences, it can be in the medicine, it can be in business, it can be in all other areas of daily human practice. You carry it on, it's been carried on through generations, and when they come to the UK, there is a receptive base, and they are in their tens of thousands here, because we gave, and I say we, speaking collectively, as people, British citizens or people in this country who accepted these refugees and quickly found that they were productive in our society, and they began to push the avant-garde because they were comfortable having already been involved with an avant-garde in Europe, across Europe. They could continue where they did because also old master dealers arrived from Germany and Austria, but where they became involved in the more progressive ideas being pushed, they felt comfortable and at home because the artists and creators were receptive to these dealers, and the dealers were happy to promote them. And there was a small audience, if not much money, there was still a small audience that would back them, promote them, and write about them because there were enlightened critics in the media.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll agree we could listen to René all night, but we must watch the time. I realise I should have introduced the other distinguished panellists. Sir Nicholas Serota needs no introduction whatsoever. I suspect, of course, director of Tate for many a long year, but now chair of Arts Council England. Nick, would you like to supplement what René has said at all?
Yes, I suppose I might begin by saying I know we're not talking about publishers tonight.
But talk about them if you wish.
But I just want, I suppose I am certainly of a generation who received their education in part because of the two publishers whose work is celebrated next door. And in particular, I think probably quite apart from Gombrich's book and Phaidon's publishing, the publication of the World of Art series. And I can remember, I mean, I was lucky enough to win a prize at school, and I chose as my prize two books. One was Herbert Reed's History of Modern Painting, and the other was Herbert Reed's History of Modern Sculpture. Not such an imaginative pairing, perhaps. Although much later, Nikos Stangos, who was subsequently, of course, the editor at Thames and Hudson, reminded me that the History of Modern Painting sold 10 times as many copies as the History of Modern Sculpture, which I think is a very interesting observation. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about Thames and Hudson or indeed Gombrich, but
they're part of the bigger story.
But if I wouldn't be here but for them in some respects. Monica asked me to say something about what I thought was distinctive about the contribution that had been made by some of these émigré refugees who ultimately became dealers. And I suppose the first and most obvious is the very fact that so many of them had come from Germany and Austria, and as René has reminded us, had those connections with the Bauhaus, but also with German Expressionism. And they found themselves in a country which both then, and I would say now, understands German art rather little. 1938 was the year in which the great exhibition was held in the New Burlington Galleries of German art. And if you look at the photographs of that exhibition, the installation photographs, and you see the extraordinary Beckmans, including his departure triptych, in that exhibition. And you can understand why it was such a shock in London. I was reminded in seeing the Braunschweig references here to the fact that, of course, he'd done an exhibition of German Jewish artists, I think in 1934.
This was a real discovery in the
Yes,
course of
which I
working on the
didn't know
show.
about at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But that exhibition in 1938, I mean, it's very, very difficult, I think, now to imagine how unfamiliar that work might have been. It was also in 1938 that Hazel McKinley, who was the sister of Peggy Guggenheim, gave to the Tate Kandinsky's Cossacks. And it was immediately put into the basement and not shown for about 15 years. So I think that clearly one of the things that this generation of dealers, as they became, brought was an understanding of German Expressionism and the international. And with that, of course, was the fact that, as René has suggested, they had an international outlook. They had a cosmopolitan outlook. They spoke languages other than French and English. But I mean, the British art world at that point, again, was essentially Francophile with respect to what your family did. It was entirely looking at Paris. And I think connected with that sense of engagement with not so much the Bauhaus, but with notions of abstraction, was the fact that a number of these dealers did embrace abstraction. And your family did in connecting with St. Ives. And we see next door Scott and others. I mean, this is by now, we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s. But there was a sympathy for a notion of abstraction, which I think, again, took a long time to establish itself in this country, and probably actually really only became established in this country, probably as a result of the introduction of, or the arrival of American art in the late 50s. So Lawrence Alloway could make an exhibition and a book, very, very important book from 1954, 9 abstract artists, which included a number of artists that were shown at Gimpel's. That was regarded again as something that was somehow un-British in some respects. Another aspect I think that they brought, not so much with them, but partly probably, I suspect, because of the experiences that they'd been through, was quite simply what one might call conviction and tenacity. If you think about being Erica Browson and showing Francis Bacon's paintings, not just in 1949, but through the 50s. If anyone saw recently at Gagosian, I think it might have just closed, the show of Bacon couplings, including the painting that belonged at one time to Lucian Freud called Buggers, of 2 men on a bed. I mean, to show that painting and a series of paintings of that kind in 1954, 5, 6, long before the reforms that came through in the mid-60s and early 70s, was a very brave thing to do. And the tenacity and conviction which these dealers showed in supporting certain artists, I mean, they weren't alone. Of course, Helen Lasalle was also showing a similar kind of conviction without going through those experiences. But I think it was very particular. And when you look at what, for instance, Annalie Judah did with the series of shows that she presented from 1970 onwards, with every summer, I can remember those shows very well. I remember the first of those shows, and it was a dose of salts actually in the British art world. I mean, Sue Grayson is sitting here smiling. I think she's recognising. Well, I can't see him. I didn't know he's behind a pillar.
You should be up here, David.
No, I mean, the conviction with which those exhibitions were presented, the professionalism with which they were presented, didn't come by chance. It was built up over a long period of time. What was also, I think, striking about a number of these dealers was the way in which they made a commitment. I mean, René referred to education and effectively to scholarship and research and a regard for learning. There are references next door to the catalogues that Marlborough began to publish in the early 50s that were really significant contributions to scholarship and understanding. They did a show of Degas bronzes, I think, in the early 50s, but later, I think in particular, I think there's a photograph of the cover of Art in Revolt, and then a series of shows that they did through the 60s, almost every year, a major show that was, and no doubt, well, of course there were works for sale, because I'll go on to explain a little bit about why in a moment, but that sense that you, even if your prime purpose was selling works of art, that you had an educational role was, I think, very much a distinctive characteristic of some of these galleries. They survived, these galleries, for a surprisingly long time. I mean, again, we sit here today in circumstances where we assume that if we buy a work of art, its value next year will be double what we paid for it. We're sitting in that it will go up and up and up and up and up, because there hasn't been a real recession in the art world for probably, there's been minor ones, but probably about 20 years. I mean, the notion that art would increase in value didn't exist in the 1950s. I mean, even in the 70s and 80s, you know, artists whose work emerged would, for 2 or 3 exhibitions, I mean, now I am looking at David, you know, for 2 or 3 or 4 exhibitions, you know, their prices would not really increase. So it was a very precarious world. And somehow the fact that these galleries lasted for as long as they did and were as effective as they were, we assumed somehow it was a straightforward exercise, and it plainly wasn't. It must have been very, very nerve-wracking running those galleries. And I suppose that they succeeded in a way in part because so many of them were very, very good at business. And again, if you look at Marlborough, I mean, it's really quite difficult again now to imagine just how powerful and dominant that gallery was until probably the mid-70s, and then it's recovered in a different way in the 80s and 90s. I mean, there was one super gallery. There are now 3 or 4, I suppose, that sort of straddle the world. The idea of having a gallery that was started in London, opened in New York, opened in Rome, opened in Zurich, is just phenomenal. Okay, Mr. Gagosian maybe have 14 of those now, but I mean, we just take these things for granted. And yet the whole of the English, but also, as I'm saying, in a way, the international art world was changed by the activity of these dealers. So if you ask what distinguished them, I think there are a whole range of reasons why they were so distinctive.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to Gill Hedley, writer, curator, and formerly director of the Contemporary Art Society, I'd like to just make 2 points on the back of what's already been said. One is that we've blithely assumed that all of them were Jewish. Not quite the whole truth. By force of historical circumstance, clearly the vast majority were. But for example, Erika Brausen, who we've been talking about, was not Jewish. She was a lesbian. She left because her purportedly deviant sexuality put her in danger under the Third Reich. So I think, you know, that is just a sort of...
certainly an outsider.
Certainly an outsider, exactly. So that's important. And also Herbert Reed has been mentioned, Roland Penrose has been mentioned, Helen Lesaur. Likewise, I think one shouldn't forget. I mean, it's very tempting, isn't it, to say, oh, England, London was a provincial, inward-turned, parochial backwater. Not quite the whole truth. I think, again, if we look at things in a slightly more nuanced way, we need to acknowledge that there were few in number, but, you know, key individuals who were, as you say, cosmopolitan, internationalist in their outlook, who actually welcomed and made the paths of the trajectories of those who came as refugees that much easier, indeed. Gill, would you like to chip in or move on to the question of gender, whichever?
That perfectly leads into what I was hoping to say. So you have asked me to talk about 3, or the women.
Indeed, unless you'd like to comment on what's been said before by the other 2, or?
I think it.
Fine,
I would like to, by if that's all right, leading into what I plan to say, because that knowledge, that education, that tenacity, that drive is something shared by women and men dealers. And I suppose that what I have been thinking about is whether there is anything that made the women dealers different, apart from the obvious that they were women. And as you rightly point out, Erica was not Jewish, but she was indeed queer. And the three women that you singled out, I'm going to refer to them by their first names. I don't think I would have dared, maybe Annalie, but not the others. So Leah Bondi-Jarre, Erica Browson, and the wonderful Annalie Judah. Now, they were of very different generations. So Leah Bondi was a generation older than Erica. Erica, 8 years, I think, older than Annalie, all born in Germany. And they came to London for different reasons and with different experiences. In Leah Bondi-Jarre's case, she had worked for and subsequently owned and ran a gallery in Vienna. And more similarly, Erica and Annalie came here and then learnt their apprenticeships working in a variety of galleries, and in Erica's case, actually working for Leah Bondi-Jarre. And just as you've explained about the male dealers, backers were required. These were not people who came with a lot of money. And those backers, very rightly, correctly by Cherith Summers in the online catalogue, are acknowledged. Otto Brill, Arthur Jeffreys, men who backed those women. But there's a lot more, as both David and René and lots of other people in the audience will say, that a dealer needs. I'm not saying that a woman dealer needs this more than a man, but there needs to be a team, both running the gallery and running home life, as David certainly knows. And those people, men and women, are also people whose names need to be teased out as the research into this fascinating field goes on. I believe in the Hanover's case, for instance, Robert Melville, a solidly trained administrator for 25 years before he went to work at the Hanover, but also a brilliant critic. And that gave a solidity in efficiency and intellectual weight to that gallery. And I think in their times in Vienna, in Paris, in Erica's case, and on Mallorca, and Annalie's time in Germany, there will have been other people, other women, I suspect, who were their role models, who taught them a manner of working and helped in their education. But again, we don't know. We don't have enough time to talk about them, and I don't know quite enough, but I know some of those people. But I was very interested in in the comments that everybody has made about that landscape in which those three galleries were developed, particularly the work that Erica and Annalie did, looking at the background that they found when they came here. They were pioneers, but they sure weren't alone. There were a lot of women, and a couple have been mentioned. And I hope you'll forgive me, but I really will not get them all right unless I put my glasses on and read. Women who have been forgotten, or perhaps not forgotten, but we don't realise they're important. So in London, there was Lucy Wertheim, who ran the Wertheim Gallery from 1930 and started the 20s group, a group of artists in their 20s. There was Dorothy Warren, who about 1928 started the Warren Gallery. Thank you, Cherith, for that bit of information. And my own particular interest, Peter Norton, who started the London Gallery immediately after the International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936 in Cork Street. But she did it, this Indian-born diplomat's wife, frightfully English, she did it for her friends who were Bauhaus émigrés. That was her sole reason for creating a gallery. And she was the one who proposed, she didn't make it happen, but she proposed the exhibition that Nick mentioned in the New Burlington Galleries. It was her idea to respond to the degenerate art show and the big German show, therefore, that followed in 1938. And in that year, Peggy Guggenheim also mentioned or opened Guggenheim Jeune next door to Peter's London Gallery. And there was Alice Story, who opened amongst many other things, she worked at the Redfern, she worked at the Storen, as did Erica Browson. But she went on to set up the American British Art Centre in 1938 and then become director of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. Lillian Browse, who is mentioned in this exhibition, working, of course, at Roland Browse in Delbanco from 1945, but it was Lillian who organised modern art exhibitions at the National Gallery throughout the war, the visual equivalent of Dame Myra Hess. Helen Lasalle, as Nick has mentioned, but in our world, by which I mean Nick's world and mine, beyond the dealer world, the public art world, Dorothy Morland was director of the ICA from 1951 to 1968. It wasn't Penrose and Reed on their own, 51 to 68. And Lillian Somerville, head of visual arts at the British Council from 47 to 1970, 47 to 1970. So they weren't on their own, these women, by any means. They were also associated with what is new, what was their contemporaries, with modernism. And as women, perhaps that novelty within the English social scene made their position clearer. They too were new. And there is certainly an idea that the glamour of the Hanover, Erica and Toto Copeman, two lesbians, possibly spies, as Toto's breathless biographer says, were a curiosity. There was a sense in which they were making good use of their role as women and as Europeans. In 1965, John Russell, in that wonderful book, Private View, described a pioneering dealer as someone who performs tasks for artists in the role of, and I quote, estate agent, employment agency, psychoanalyst, sea lawyer, chauffeur, maquereau, a pimp, social secretary, handyman, investment counsellor, impresario, and scribe. And oh, how familiar that sounds. Now, I'm treading on slightly dangerous ground here, and I am not about to say that Leah, Erica, or Annalie were nurturers of their artists because they were women. God forbid that I should say that. But every dealer of the modern era who looks after his or her artist has to, in some way, perform those roles, as do many curators. And the gallery team will be set up so that artists are looked after. Francis Bacon is the perfect example. He couldn't live his life without his nanny, and then Erica Browson, and then the glorious Valerie Beston at Marlborough. He was an extreme example. But that notion of taking care of an artist, male or female, their private lives as well as their production, and just managing their expectation and their nerves and everything else, is something that I suspect quite a lot of artists might find easier, or maybe found easier then, to take from women, or rather they might have reached out for that. I'm not sure about it, and I'm not setting Erica up, certainly as a nurturing woman. But she was savvy. She knew what was needed. She gave Bacon an allowance, and I know that her relationship with other artists was as deep and as caring. It is an important issue. I will not say, however, that any of these women, including the great list I read out, were sisters under the skin. I think women dealers representing women artists, it's a big subject to be looked into. But I'd just like to end by saying that, as well as those fairly random list of women that I read out to you, I'd just like us to remember that there were one of the most important things in terms of international modernism was, of course, the creation of the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1929. So again, that background, women dealers coming here, it was accepted that modernism was an international phenomenon. They were handmaidens to it, but it was women that had been behind the creation of MoMA in New York, 3 extraordinary women. And they were known as the Adamantine Ladies. And I would just like to say that our 3 were as adamantine as anybody you can think of.
Thank you very much. One might even posit the idea on the back of what you said, that, you know, both as Jews, with the exception of Erica, but let's say both as Jews and as women, you are doubly outsider in your status and therefore perhaps doubly driven and motivated to make your mark in the terrain which has not yet been
Indeed. And
consolidated, if you like.
They,
yes,
yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
René, Nick, would you like to add anything to the question of gender before we take a retrospective look?
Sure. I'm just thinking of, that's a remarkable list, Gill, and it occurs to me what would be interesting would be to compare the women who were involved in business in other areas in the late 40s and in the 50s up to the early 60s, in other areas of business or the arts, and with the women who made these remarkably successful galleries, Annelie and the Hanover Gallery, for instance, as you've concentrated on those 2, because as we know, even now, the constant fretting by the government, any government, do we have enough women at the higher echelons of business? That is, are they directors of something? These women were directors in a lonely field, and when you say that maybe not much sisterly support, I don't think there was much brotherly support for them either. Let's just say. So that's one comment. The only other comment I would like to pick up on something you said about the important, you mentioned MoMA, and that reminds me that in the 50s and the 60s, for all of us, David might concur in here too, the 50s and 60s, the British art market, in talking of the private art galleries, depended largely on the goodwill of American collectors coming over here. They were the backbone, and they were the big spenders, and they kept the British art market flourishing, in my view.
Nick, would you like to add anything to the issue of gender?
No, I mean, to pick up René's point, obviously there were women very active in the theatre, in dance, and in music, but probably not in that small scale where they were working in Theatre Royal Stratford East or Rambert is another example.
I think what's also very striking, and it's as true, for example, in the realm of photography, that there are so many unfamiliar names out there. We need to be doing the research. We need to bring them back into the limelight. There is, for example, as we speak, at the Wiener Library in Bloomsbury, in Russell Square, a wonderful exhibition about a totally unknown, successful Berlin Jewish photographer. Gertie Simon was her name. She comes to this country in the late 30s. She's also successful. Who's heard of her now? Just one example. So there is much still, I think, to be brought back into the limelight. I'm aware of time rushing by. Perhaps we can just conclude and hopefully have some time for questions with, as I say, sort of a retrospective, perhaps, reflection on their significance. Taking perhaps René, you first, and then Nick, and then Gill. With hindsight, how might we assess or summarize the nature of these figures' contribution? What do we owe them?
We owe them, Nick used the term cosmopolitan. That was a very important outlook. It was a cosmopolitan outlook in a country that was ready to be receptive to all these new ideas coming in. I mean, you mentioned that getting German art accepted. It's true, that was very difficult, and I think the Tate, I remember speaking to Harry Fisher about when he tried to approach the Tate to get them to buy Egon Schiele back in, I think, Rothenstein's times, but very difficult. Okay, fine. So then we have to move on further. But nevertheless, it was constantly opening up to new, it was opening up all the time. And in some ways, it was almost easier for art dealers in the visual arts because sooner or later there would be breaches made with collectors here, enthusiastic collectors, with the museums who would then say, let us start collecting this field and that field. Nick, you did a great job opening up to a lot of European and American artists. And for instance, just to, if I may, to compare to the problems in other, we were lucky, and I really do think we were lucky as people in the art field dealing in art, because if you were teaching academic philosophy, you would find there was analytical philosophy, and then there was continental philosophy, Hegel and all the other problems. But the analytic philosophy was it, and it still is to a large extent very important in academic philosophy in this country. But the visual arts world, it's opened up completely. So isn't that fantastic?
Thank you, Nick.
I think one of the contributions that we've not talked about, which I think is was fundamental, was the fact that the presence of these kinds of exhibitions in the centre of London also made possible the growth of the study of art history in this country. Obviously the Courtauld is an example, but especially in the 60s with the opening up of opportunity and the creation of art history courses in East Anglia,
Sussex.
in Essex,
Sussex.
in Sussex, in York. I mean, quite significantly, these were all the new universities, so-called at that time.
Worth mentioning, I mean, Hess, Hans Hess.
Hans Hess was in
York and
Sussex.
Sussex,
He was in both York and Sussex.
Linton, from the same backgrounds.
Yes.
Now, the whole realm of art history, of course, is tightly interwoven with what we've been talking about, absolutely intrinsic. I mean, think of Gombrich, you know, the best-selling art history book of all time. The migration, if that's the word, the transplant of the Warburg Institute, remarkable phenomenon. It utterly transformed, I mean, you know, you mentioned the Courtauld, but of course the Warburg, as an institution, stock and barrel, comes to this country, and it puts the discipline of art history on a serious academic footing that had really never been regarded as prior to that. So that's a whole other area. There is actually going to be a 2-day conference on the émigré art historians at Queen Mary College in November, so look out for that. So these are important terrains. Gill.
When Nick mentioned publishers and the importance in his life, and I too, my one and only prize, it was the art prize because nobody else was studying art. So I got the prize, and that too was from the World of Art series. But also, like Nick, when I went to the Courtauld, Nick went to the Courtauld, and I, again, and we owe that institution to émigrés. As you were both talking, I suddenly remembered a program I heard a little while ago. I'm addicted to Great Lives, Matthew Paris's biographical program. And I listened to another Courtauld alumnus, Jeremy Deller. And he chose Brian Epstein. And his point was, without Brian Epstein, there would have been no Beatles. Nice group, nice guys, good music. Brian Epstein, shaped, polished, acted like that great list of the chauffeur, sea lawyer, McElroy. He did that for the Beatles. And without Brian Epstein, Jeremy was positing, there would have been no 1960s in the way that we know it. No swinging London, no most of our backgrounds. And I would like gently to make the suggestion that some of these dealers did exactly that for us in London. Robert Melville, who a great unsung hero, I believe, said that if ever he'd been given a gallery to run, which he never really wanted to do. It would have been a mixture of Arthur Jeffries and Robert Fraser, Cool Bob, Cool Bob. And those sort of galleries, Signals, House, the small galleries that informed my young life, couldn't have been there without that cosmopolitan, knowledgeable base of the dealers that we've been looking at, I don't believe. Some of them were flashes in the pan, others were not. Some of them were thoughtful and tremendously risk-taking. So no 60s. That's
a good point. And a good point.
But only to quote Jeremy Deller.
Indeed, a good point at which to conclude the official panel discussion. I'm pleased to say that we do indeed have about 10 minutes for questions. But first of all, thank you very much indeed, René, Nick, and Gill. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think we need to have a very short pause, but perhaps if we can already have some hands up. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do about microphones. Is there one, a roving one? Yes? Can we?
Thank you. Two questions which are totally disconnected, but anyway, I think relevant. One is Bernard Berenson, who arguably was the most famous dealer pre-war, actually didn't come to UK. Is that of any relevance that he didn't? The second one on the Marlborough Gallery is, did the advent of David Somerset make a big difference to it, or was it already on the map before he arrived?
I'm certainly not equipped to answer either of those properly, so I'll hand over to one of you. Do we have any Berenson experts in the audience?
I suspect Berenson might not have spent time here in part because he could not. There were not many collectors at that moment. It was a moment when paintings were leaving this country rather than arriving in terms of collecting. I mean, there was very little early 20th century collecting of old masters in this country.
But much selling at the end of the war.
On David Somerset, I'm sure that Gilbert Lloyd and the family would have recognized that they gained entree to certain collectors through David Somerset that they would never have achieved had they not brought him in as chairman of Marlborough in 1948. And I mean, the success of Marlborough, I'm not saying the success began in 48, but it was not that successful in 46, 47. I mean, I don't know what was. Not many galleries were very successful in those immediate post-war years. I'm sure that they would recognize him as having played a crucial role. And I imagine, actually, you probably know the answer to this question. It wasn't David's idea to call it Marlborough, was it?
No,
it was Harry's idea.
Yes, it was Harry's idea to give it
Suitably English,
seriously,
noble.
He commented, everything seems to be called Marlborough in this country.
Talking about names, might I just add, just in case people don't know, that the Sotheby's now has a gallery opposite where we're sitting now called the S2, a smaller gallery, which was where the St George's Gallery...
I wondered where it was. Okay.
Where Leah Bondi Jarrai's St George's Gallery started. It had had many iterations from the 19th century. Erica worked there. The St George's Gallery moved, took the name, left St George's Street, but moved with another rather splendid woman, Agatha Sadler, Otto Brill's daughter. But Erica Brausen, who had left home in Dusseldorf to discover modern art in Hanover, called it the Hanover because of her background and the fact, obviously, it was just off Hanover Square, taking the most English of names and replacing it with an equally local, if you take my meaning, Hanover. Sorry, just to add that to the Marlborough tale.
Good. Any other hands up? I need my glasses for this. Yes, lady at the back there.
Thank you, and thank you very much. That was super interesting. There are still today there are quite a lot of Jewish dealers, quite a high proportion of dealers who are Jewish or in some way, other ways, émigrés. How do you think that relates to what we're talking about? Is it a continuation of the same? Was it kicked off at this point, or is that just by chance?
Well, to some extent, if I can give a short, to some extent, this type of business tends to be a family business, or one where people, if it gets larger and bring outside partners come in, nevertheless there is somebody within the family from generation to generation who remains involved. So on that, in that score, there are very few very big galleries. The Marlborough is a fantastic example. Actually, it's the first gallery in the world to make artists superstars in the Hollywood sense. I mean, there should be a whole study of what it managed to do in the 60s, because it's quite extraordinary. But and you mentioned Gagosian, there is, if there is a continuity, and the fact that galleries do get opened, let us say, in proportion to the population by a higher percentage of people coming who are Jews or from Jewish families, it's also because the collectors, a higher proportion of collectors may be Jewish or of Jewish backgrounds. It seems to be a tradition that is persisting. Now, whether it will persist in the future or not, I couldn't say. That's first thoughts anyway on it.
I think it goes back to what somebody touched on earlier. It is obviously to do with financial acumen. I mean, let's not deny that you need business expertise, if not flair, to make a gallery or indeed any other business succeed, but also tied in with this much deeper sense of the importance of culture that they brought from elsewhere, which I would like to think is retained to this day. Nick, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, one has to remember that there are other galleries that have moved from generation to generation in this country. One thinks of Freddie Mayer in the 30s and 40s, succeeded, of course, very successfully over the last 40 years or nearly 50 years now, by James. So it's not exclusively within one part of society.
It's worth mentioning, I mean, apropos Freddie Mayer, that he worked very closely in tandem with Alfred Flechtheim, who was a force to be reckoned with. Incidentally, there's a wonderful portrait of Flechtheim in the Gertie Simon exhibition I just mentioned, worth checking out. So, another example of the importance of these alliances, if you like. Yeah. Yes. There's somebody.
Actually, it's not a question, it's probably a correction to an omission. There's one name that meets both criteria as an émigré artist and a female, not artist and dealer, Halima Nawaj.
Yes.
The Ryan Gallery,
Yes.
indeed.
From 1957 till 1998.
Yes.
And actually her archive is at Tate.
Yes.
Actually open to anyone who would be interested in researching.
Yes. My apologies, but I was trying to keep to the earlier. I mean, there are so many omissions, but she is a very, very.
And she is mentioned. I think I'm right, Auntie Sue, in the catalogue, in the
Yes.
online catalogue.
Yes.
Indeed. Thank you. Yes, there's somebody.
Ask Francis.
Where's the microphone gone?
Yeah. It's there. Go on.
I just wanted to refer again to the wider cultural ambience and to acknowledge the role of the BBC, which literally gave a voice to so many émigrés, not only in the art world, of course, but from many other walks of life. But although the listenership was, of course, largely a middle-class one, and the readership for the listener, their magazine, it was extremely influential. And that had a real impact on so many people in the mid-20th century.
And the key person there was Leonie Cohen, of course.
Yeah.
Was taken in as a young woman by Herbert Reed.
Yeah.
Yes. to help her. Yes, another.
Do you think that part of the importance was the actual very small geographical area in central London in which all these people were working. When I started in Bond Street in 1961, I was looking up a street directory the other day for Westminster. There were 23 galleries in Bond Street in those days. Yeah. Now there are none. And the fraternity between dealers, lunching together in little cafes, etc., was very important in the dissemination of a lot of this knowledge.
Can I?
Go on, you were there. Go on.
Well, I wasn't there.
You were
at the
lunching.
time. But I think that's an excellent observation. In the 1920s, Virginia Woolf, and in the 1930s, George Orwell, in their diaries, mention from time to time, not often, that they were going to see the exhibitions in Cork Street. So it was a very tight, small group. In fact, when Cork Street began to be dismantled because of the encroaching fashion trade, our trade association and others had meetings with Westminster Council and various different people, and we tried to emphasize the historical importance. And I mentioned the fact that they already in the 20s, one of our top writers was just as a throwaway remark mentioning going to see an exhibition there. That is, this is where people go, just as they go to Savile Row for tailoring, which seems to have been well preserved, but Cork Street is under more threat. So it is true that the fact that it's a small area, I agree, was very important to nurturing.
It is 7 o'clock. I feel we must stop there because I'm sure some of you would like to go back, and if you haven't already had a good look at the exhibition. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. And so, have you got the mic?
I just want your patience for 1 minute. Can I just have your patience for 1 minute? Because perhaps I need a mic.
Where's the microphone? No.
Sorry, it will only be a minute because I want you to enjoy the exhibition. I'm the co-curator with Cherith Summers of the exhibition. But what I have to do is thank an awful lot of people that are here. I'm not going to thank you all by name, but the show couldn't have happened without the generosity of a lot of lenders, private and from the commercial world. And if you're here, thank you very much. I know some of you are. But it also couldn't have happened without the support of a number of companies who I will mention. Hallett Independent, and Adam Prideaux, I know, is here, saved our bacon, so to speak. We do have a Francis Bacon. We couldn't have afforded to insure it without that kind of help. We had Connoisseur International Fine Art collect and will return at the end of the exhibition. Don't worry, if you've lent to us, it will come back in good shape at the end. We also had incredible support from Mishcon de Rea, who are supporting our events program, and of course Sotheby's, our terrific hosts, and we wouldn't be here at all without Sotheby's, and particularly Richard Aronovich, who actually, as the restitution department, made sure that we were here and that we got our 3.5 weeks and that we have this wonderful free exhibition, but also private donors who came and saved us right at the beginning, made it possible to get this far. And I think some of them are here, and I hope that they will announce themselves to me afterwards because I haven't met them all. Ivor Bracker, I know, isn't here. He was our first supporter. John and Susan Burns, Simon and Rebecca Silver, and Jeffrey Gruder, QC, all came to support us when we really needed, as a small charity. The Insider Outsiders Festival and Arts Foundation is a very small charity, so thank you to all of you for making it possible to share these stories that we're sharing next door and the wonderful exhibition. Well, I shouldn't say wonderful exhibition as I co-curated it, but I have had a lot of very complimentary remarks this evening, so I'll choose to say, go and enjoy the exhibition. And thank you so much for coming and being such a good audience.
Very nice, thank you. One last thing.
catalogue. Look at the catalogue. Sorry, most important, Cherith Summers wrote the most incredible catalogue, full of information, and you can get it online. And Cherith, where are you? Put up your hand.
Yes, I think she deserves, absolutely.
Amazing job.